Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Theta Ministries. I'm your host, Wes. And today we're going to be doing an episode that's a bit different than what we're used to doing. So I promised in my post a little bit ago that I wanted to do a church history series, and we're going to be starting out this series with a very prevalent church father named Saint Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch. Now, I did some more research over the past week tried to fill some gaps in my knowledge that I don't think were there a whole lot, and I'm here to present to you the history of Saint Ignatius and why he is important to church history, and why his view of the church is actually more on our side than it is on Rome's side, from a Protestant perspective. I want to start defending general Protestant apologetics on my channel because I haven't found a direction yet, but I think this is the most prevalent direction that I can take this channel in. So, we're going to be starting out this church history series from a Protestant perspective from me. So it'll be the slideshow I made, and I'll be doing the couple slides that I did make, and we'll be going over what I've found from my years of research, and yeah, let's get into it. So, this is the origins. I wrote this down. This is he was born in Syria. He was born roughly 30 to 50 AD. Now, generally, you'll find on Wikipedia or Google, you'll find it says that he was born between 30 to 50 AD, but some historical scholars cite that he was born around 30 to 35 AD. So it would make sense if he was because of this next line here. So later named Theophorus, right there in the Greek, if I can't move my mouse over here. Theophorus, or Theophorus, however you want to pronounce it, God-bearer. This may, so in full, he probably would have been called Ignatius Theophorus. This may have been due to the fact that an early historical tradition predicts that Ignatius, as a young boy, was indeed the boy who was grabbed as the example for humility as a child in Matthew 18:1 through 4. Now, in Matthew 18:1 through 4, you have Christ bringing a child amongst the disciples when he's teaching them in parables and saying, you must become like this child. He grabs a random child from the crowd amongst them and says, you must become like this child to enter the kingdom of heaven. You must be humble like this child. And so it's theorized that potentially because his family traveled to Jerusalem and Rome when he was a child, and hence why his family inherited Christianity, as we're going to get down to the bottom of this list now, he may have potentially been the child involved in Matthew 18:4, but we don't know. He was potentially a disciple of John the Apostle. He became a bishop of Antioch in 69 AD. He took upon Christianity as a young boy, as his family tradition had held. He was amongst of the first few apostolic fathers. I actually wrote down a little bit more about that below that. He was martyred in Rome, Italy, by Emperor Trajan in roughly 107 AD. Now, this next slide actually relates to the previous line. He was close with another early church father named Polycarp, Bishop of Smyrna, who was in a real sense his real spiritual successor. But we can get into that in another video. He was martyred by lions as he sacrificed to Roman idols because he was a Christian. And he was an early Christian writer. Now, just a note here from a historical perspective, actually on his way to go be martyred by Emperor Trajan in 107 AD, he wrote letters to Polycarp saying how he was joyful and glad that he was going to be martyred. And that's one of the famous epistles he'd written was to the Bishop Polycarp, but before he became a bishop, obviously. But yeah, we'll move on to the next slide that I had made, so we'll go on here. So he often wrote epistles to churches or people in specific on certain details, certain issues such as his salvation, his struggles on being persecuted, and his own death. His most known epistles are the 7 following: to the Ephesians, to the Romans, to the Smyrnians, Polycarp, to the Magnesians, to the Trallians, and to the Philadelphians. Now, I've read through some of the epistles, and I've read his epistle to Polycarp as well. But something I wanted to make a note of here, because a lot of people who read Ignatius, who come from the Roman Catholic perspective and not the Protestant perspective, or who will read them from the Orthodox perspective, they'll say there's a mention of a bishop in the church structure of authority that Ignatius mentions especially in, I think, his even most popular epistle, which would be to the Ephesians. He writes to them mentioning this bishop over and over and over again, saying, be under the bishop, and to the person who's on the Roman Catholic side will read that and see that's talking about the archbishop, and he doesn't say that. So Ignatius will mention the church structure in the Ephesian letters. He mentions unity in the church letter under the bishop. And yet I want to make a note of here of why it's not exactly their reading of these epistles. So I want to make a note here before I move on to my next slide, because I noted it in my next slide, but I just kept it as a note for my brain to memorize. So these letters were often historically seen as short form or long form letters. Now, due to some historical variances, there might be a forgery amongst these epistles from Ignatius. So generally, what's more held to, more researched upon, is these short form letters of these epistles. And so the one I reanalyzed most recently was, of course, the epistle to the Ephesians. And what I found was, reading through his epistle in each of the sections, it's not very many sections, it's only a couple sections. When he mentions the bishops, the deacons, the elders, the presbyters, same office, he talks about how they're under the bishop, and then he does that for the exact same letter for each church. Stay under the bishop, stay under the bishop. And so when the Roman Catholic reads these letters, it says, see, when you, and of course the famous Cardinal Henry Newman quote, that when you read history, you cease to be Protestant, that whole thing. They see this, and that's like, that's where we get it from because of Ignatius or Irenaeus, and they talk about that stuff. In these letters, however, in each of these except for Polycarp primarily, the rest of these were all addressing churches. This is addressing a personal letter to Polycarp, but these are all churches in Smyrna, Magnesia, Trelia, Philadelphia, Ephesus, Rome. They're all two churches that have church structures under bishops, deacons, elders, presbyters, or presbyteros. So in each of these letters, he writes to them about their own bishops, not one bishop over all the churches combined. And so what we see in reading these letters is that they have their own separate bishops, not an archbishop over all these churches. That's they'd be justified in decently making an argument for papal supremacy if all these letters were written with the archbishop, or an archbishop being mentioned in these letters in mind. Then they'd have an argument for that. But they don't, because each of these letters that Ignatius of Antioch writes, the bishop writes, is that each of these churches have their own bishops. And when he writes to Polycarp, he doesn't really mention church structure. He more so mentions his persecution and death, and like I said, along the way to being fed to the lions and killed and martyred as a Christian in Rome. He basically writes to Polycarp saying, I'm glad that I'm going to be suffering just as Christ suffered, compares his suffering to Christ's suffering in redemption, and he writes some scripture in there to compare his suffering to Christ's suffering. So that's the whole thing. So that's pretty much it. They often assume that these are all under one archbishop. Whenever Ignatius writes these letters, he writes to them about their own church bishops. Now, we can go through, I think this coming Wednesday won't be a bad idea. I can read through the epistle to the Ephesians, and we can go through it line by line and see what Ignatius is really talking about when he mentions bishops, because, of course, episkopos has to mean something, right? It doesn't just mean nothing. So we don't have to be scared reading church history or researching it openly, because I've done the research myself. I'm still here and what I'm at. So that'll be it for this video. I made another slide, but I, of course, I was going to make this another slide of the next video. But so, anywho, we'll leave that there. That is a little bit of church history. That's an introduction to the series. This will be episode 1. The episodes here probably not be too long if they're not the letters themselves being directly addressed. So I will pause it here, and we will continue on Wednesday. Grace and peace. Love you all.